So we now turn to our discussants who have many things to say, I'm sure, about the, how we say, the thoughts that we've seen here today and are contained in the report. Should we start to...
Can I just get it?
Is there a sequence in which to go? George Soros, would you like to begin?
Well, I think this is really, I thought the presentation was amusing, but the report itself is very substantial, very much needed, and it's remarkable how little discussion there has been of these problems. And it's extremely timely to have this report out. We are on the verge of perhaps having some kind of regulation of financial markets, but it hasn't been properly prepared. And it's been, if there is a deal, it's arrived at in the back rooms, dealings between two senators without public discussion. And I'm afraid that what will come out of it is not going to be adequate to the problem. I think what we do need urgently is a regulator protecting the public, because the public has been very badly treated in this bailout. Because while interest rates were dropped to practically zero to the banks have raised their rates on credit cards to unprecedentedly high rates, 20–30%. And of course, this is what is creating a tremendous resentment, and very justified resentment. So this needs to be cured. So we need a financial regulator, and I think the case has been made that the Federal Reserve, whose primary responsibility is to protect the financial system, to prevent it from collapsing. And it was necessary to have a bailout, because otherwise we would have been in the 1930s. So the one lesson we learned from the 1930s is to prevent a collapse of the financial system. After the failure of Lehman Brothers, we put it on artificial life support, where it still is. And we are lucky that was achieved. Otherwise, we would be probably by now in a much more severe recession than currently. So the Federal Reserve is committed to that task. And there is an innate conflict of interest then, that they would also be protecting the consumers. So when Barney Frank quoted a joke, I think he's right. This is absolutely unacceptable. So the problems are extremely complex, and they will require a lot more discussion, study. And I think if there's any criticism that I would have to the presentation, that there is an unnamed culprit here, which is the economic profession, economics, which has developed the efficient market hypothesis, the rational expectations theory, which has led to all these very elaborate synthetic instruments designed on the wrong principle, namely with the belief that markets actually correct their excesses and you don't need regulation. So I think that that is the one thing that we haven't, that hasn't been named. So I think to come back to the present moment, which is a very important moment, we need a consumer protection agency. We need it very urgently, because there is a political outcry about the injustice of the present situation. And we need a more, and that will not deal with the real problem of having to reform the financial system. That can take time, actually. It's more important to do it right than to do it right away.
Lyndon Turner?
I commend the Roosevelt Institute for holding this today as well. We're at a critical point in time. Even as we're discussing this here, they're negotiating what looks to be a final package in Washington, D.C. And that final package, as George just mentioned, is far from the package that's going to be necessary to really give us markets that work. And our markets are the crown jewel of this country and its economics. Whenever the markets haven't worked, the economy has suffered. But more importantly than the economy suffered, the people in this country have suffered. We have now got 25 to 27 million people trying to find a job. These are hardworking Americans who want to work, want the opportunity to get a paycheck and take home and provide for their families, and yet they can't. And so for Congress at this point in time to be rushing through, come up with an answer that isn't going to work is unconscionable. And Senator Dodd, Senator Shelby, Senator Corker, Senator Warner, and the group that are negotiating on this need to step back, take a breath of fresh air, and think about it. Why is it that we're giving the Fed, the Consumer Protection Agency, the Fed or the Treasury Consumer Protection Agents? They've never protected consumers. And for the last 2 years, Shelby and Dodd have been very outspoken and critical of the very people they're talking about giving it to. After Frank did such a nice job of outlining the $600 trillion in derivatives, why is it that we can't get meaningful exchanges and clearinghouses for the vast majority of those derivatives? And why is it that the bank's balance sheets to this day are still very non-transparent? Why is it that the Fed and banking regulators continue to let them bleed out the losses rather than show investors what they're really worth? So we just aren't getting there. And if we don't get there, there's no question, there can be no question, that the markets will be back into this sooner rather than later. Whether it's 5 or 10 years or 15 years down the road may be a fair question. But there's no question that it's a matter of not if, but when it will turn around and repeat. And unfortunately, our government in Washington, D.C., and I've seen this all too often in working with Washington, has become something rather than a government, we the people. Instead of we the people, it's become I the banks. And I had a discussion just this weekend with a very distraught former banking regulator who highlighted how the influence of the banking industry, the finance industry, which since 1990 has put $2.3 billion, $2.3 billion in the campaign coffers. And the only thing you can come back to as you look at Shelby and Dodd, who have said no to a lot of the stuff they're now doing, to Obama, who said, absolutely, I've got to have an independent consumer protection agency, and now is starting to waffle on that point. The only explanation is that instead of we the people, our government is now I the banks, and that is nothing short of corruption at its worst in this country.